So today's discussion is all about human synchrony, which I've framed in more of a general way, in the sense of human synchrony as both a phenomena and a mechanism itself. There's something that's deeply mechanistic in the sense of like literally neurons firing at the same time, and that has that's sort of like the most specific definition in a certain sense, brain-brain synchrony. But we can also think of it behaviorally, of course, and those two things are tightly linked. And then more general, from we could just say a functional kind of perspective, the role of human synchrony. While there's a mechanism there that's quite profound, that we have the capacity to try to, that our brains synchronize at all, that our behavior synchronizes at all, and that we're so good at it and attuned to it, it's connected to all kinds of interesting phenomena, so much of which are almost paradigmatic of the human experience. So it kind of places human synchrony. Maybe it's just something cool to imagine, but maybe it's something that is at the root of a lot of very human behaviors. Things like, I've identified three that I think are really interesting: the formation and replication of social norms. How does synchrony in our behavior and our minds actually form and then enforce social norms? Which is the act of basically following conventions sort of automatically and often in coordinated fashion. How does human synchrony boost pro-social behavior and bonding? So the experience of synchrony between people can bond them to each other, can basically affect our very relationships, and can help us behave more pro-socially. And then another interesting one by the psychologist Jim Cohn is all about basically a social extension of our subjective experiences. His famous experiment about hand holding while in an MRI machine, and then being given minor shocks of electricity or other kind of subtly unpleasant activities, that when they were holding the hands of a loved one or even a stranger, that their subjective experience of pain was lower, and their brains literally showed less basically response to any of these stimuli. So at that point becoming somewhat less subjective. So basically suggesting that our very subjective experience of all kinds of things basically takes into account our social surroundings, and more specifically, the immediacy of the others around us, to the extent that we can become more than just ourselves. Like, we extend our very selves, and can respond to the environment and respond to each other in this kind of profound way. So I think there's at the heart, we can kind of get lost in picturing neurons and things like that. And I think that's actually quite interesting. And certainly people have thoughts there. But it's probably, given that that's sort of the mechanism, and an important one to keep in mind, synchrony being the matching of actions and time with others. So synchrony it's in the same time. And I think if we keep that at the heart, then we'll stay on track. But I think more importantly is, what is the kind of phenomenology of this, and the way that it shows up again and again, how human behavior is kind of conditioned around doing things in time, in coordination, not just doing them in the same way, but doing them in the same way in the same moment, seems to be a key aspect to a lot of very human behaviors, and especially our general pro-social proclivities. So with that, I also want to invite us to do a little postulating around just our own experiences of these. Like, I think you can call to mind all kinds of examples, and it'd be interesting to just see what examples we've all experienced, because there's so many activities that we participate in where synchrony is at the core, whether it's playing music or sports or what have you, cooking together. I mean, there's just so many things that you can bring in, and we could examine, are these synchrony in the same way? I think that'd be interesting to see. So with that, I'll open it up and see if anybody, please raise your hand virtually, or if you prefer to just raise it, I'll try to catch you. Diane.
Yeah, well, you opened up a pretty much broader area than one would gather from the readings, because that seemed to focus on coordination between brains. But what you're saying means also coordination with behavior. And I was actually thinking about that ahead of time. And there's so many different examples, everything from, dancing together to you therapists out there are probably familiar with how you can adjust your posture and your facial expression to the person who's talking to you in such a way that it encourages them and leads to a kind of, alliance or bonding or whatever. And it also seemed like you're suggesting that ritual, which forces people into same behavior at the same time, may be a very important social artifact, which we know also anyway.
Yeah, well, so the observer perspective is all of these various ways that our behavior shows up in kind of matching form to others. But I think the profound thing about it is that our very neural experiences are, and I guess it's no surprise, but that being the mechanism that, the saying neurons that fire together wire together applies to multiple brains at the same time, not just one. And so that would be at the heart of various kind of group prosocial coordinated sort of experiences. Makes sense in that the more similar our very brains are firing, the more similar our behavior will be. So, if anybody wants to get into the neuroscience, I won't stop you, but I'm staying at the observer level because that's what we can see. Hank.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. First thing I wanted to mention is I read mostly read through one of Diane's papers, I think is a while back, on the integration of integrating theory about morality, which I don't know if people know about, but I didn't look at the whole thing fully, but it's quite thorough. And I think Diane, back then, I don't know when you wrote it, I forget to look at the date, but it's a while ago, you talk about some various theories about that, not from the perspective of synchrony, the way we're talking. So I just wanted to thank you for letting me know about that. And
Thanks.
so that's one, and that's helpful. The other is I want to take, you won't be surprised, but the perspective of when you said stage coordination of behavior. And I want to talk about the difficulties for prosociality when we can coordinate behavior for violence, doing harm, manipulation, just take a whole list of that. So I want to at least, because I pay attention to that, partially because of my background, that I look at that stuff, as well as how that gets in the way from a positive kind of what we're saying is prosociality. So in my work, just as a therapist, you see, and I work with groups and families and couples and individuals, and even some organizational consulting way back, but just in the more immediate, there are people band together to compete, to hurt, to harm, to manipulate. So, and I think these issues need to be paid attention as we look at how do we create pro-social environments, and especially as a therapist, how do you get somebody, you know, if some of you know about the internal world of object relations, we have many parts that this multiple self phenomenon where they don't get along. And so there are theories like internal family systems theory, the object relations of Ronald Fairbairn, that you work with the parts in some fashion to see if you can find them, help them be pro-social and cooperate in the interest of biophilia, about vitality and living in life in a sort of a more positive way. So just to remind people, I think about that, and I want to just put it on the table too.
David? You're muted.
I always forget that. Thank you. So you know, we're always influenced by the last thing we heard. So Hank, thank you. I'm going to add to what I was going to say, simply that I think that part of that coordination and the pro-social arena, or includes also the ACT matrix, and that is one of those that sort of brings you back. You know, so I see those as complementary approaches, so strategies. And I think so when I think of pro-social in terms of community building, I think of both of those, and that the ACT matrix is the one that helps us to come back on track. But so do the 8 core design principles. But I thought what I would share about your question, Sage's question, I should say, is share 2 things. One is the observation that in nature, there's evidence of swarms, right? Where there's a lot of synchrony happening. Bees, birds, think of flocks of birds that just, you know, they seem to be going in random ways, and yet they're all moving together. And if any of you had the pleasure of watching one of the ProSocial webinars given by a guy who has studied the pygmies of West Central Africa, and they're singing for 24 hours. And making harmony that we would consider a cacophony, but it's everybody doing their own thing, but they're all following it, and they sit on the ground, and somebody picks a thread, and then the others pick it up, or they don't, or you know, and it's all sounds like a cacophony to us, but it's harmony to them, and it's how they center their lives. It's their exercise for coming together in synchrony, and it's extraordinary when you watch it because it looks crazy. But it was a very moving thing, that, and I associate that with the swarm. And the other is the only other point that I wanted to share was, this immediately popped into my head when Sage asked the question. I was a runner when I was young, and I ran the 440, and in my school district, I'd won that race for 2 years in a row, and this was my final race before graduating from high school, and I was like 7th. I was like 4th or 6th in the field, and people were way on, and I'm on the final stretch, and you move into what they call in sports the zone. And in the zone, I think, is where we find synchrony also. And so you'll be happy to know that I did win the race in the end, but it was just this focus. I still have this perfect memory of it, right? The crowd of students on the bleachers and the runners in front of me and the tape at the end of the 100 yards, final 100 yards, and just running. And it's like everything was quiet, deadly quiet. There was just things happening around me, but I was deadly quiet. And that to me is a powerful synchrony that we all, us humans, have. So I just wanted to share it as an example of how I experienced synchrony. I hope it adds to the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I think it brings to mind the difference between sort of just coordination in the broad sense, coordination, just like we're doing similar things, and what's the deepest level we could go? We could call that, like true synchrony, where our brains from the bottom up are, they're literally, our neural experiences are if you looked at them, if you measured them, they're like happening in the same time in many of the same ways. So the difference between one person and the next at a certain point starts to become almost just trivial. And from my own experience playing music, it's really easy. And I think you can think of any kind of coordinated activity. There is some sort of shift, some sort of threshold that happens from the difference of like, we're doing things together. And then there's an emergent state, I think, that occurs when you really get to like a synchronous level. Perhaps it is at the neural level that, there's like a temporal synchrony or something like that. But suddenly your intuition around, those around you takes a whole new level, something you can't think your way into. It's a very experiential thing. If you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. So to me, there is like a fundamental difference of synchrony than just like coordinated activity. We could do things in coordinated fashion without being in sync. We're really good at sort of doing things all the time, and yet having totally different experiences. And so I think there's when we picture marches and rallies, musicians, sports, everyone knows what it looks like to watch like a group of musicians on stage or a sports team when there's just something is happening. They're like moving as one. That same kind of flock swarm mentality. Yeah, we can examine that from different directions. Is it that they're all kind of just following each other, creating this sort of recursive feedback loop? They get closer and closer and closer together in their behavior. I think that's part of it. But that shift, there is some sort of emergent threshold that creates like synchrony, wherein you could watch any individual and switch to the next, and they seem to be moving as a shared unit. So we'll do Steve and then Hank.
I just had a couple of comments way back in the beginning when Diane was talking about synchrony and dancing. I wanted to say it's quite obvious you've never seen me dancing, Diane, or you might have to revise that hypothesis. But when I was listening to David talking about being in the zone, I actually thought he was talking about a different phenomenon, which psychologists call flow. Some of you may be aware of that and the research on flow. And I think there's some interesting connections between flow and synchrony, but flow is something you can experience alone, immersion in an activity, etc. The only other comment I wanted to make was to just elaborate on what I put in the chat earlier, which is that I think of synchrony like a tool. And it's a tool, like most tools, that can be used for good or evil. And so some of the readings that we did for today talked about the relationship between synchrony and pro-social behavior, which is great to know. But I think it's also worth remembering that bad actors have manipulated synchrony, if you will, for very bad ends. So that's just another, there's a dark side to synchrony as well. So, sorry to be interrupting our kumbaya sing along, but
I
There's
feel less
worth
alone
noting
for
that.
the moment, Steve. I feel less
Right.
alone.
Me too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hank?
Well, let me, I'm sorry, I'll go back to the dark side. I spent some time in the Army Reserve, but in the military, and you get to get some training, and they're preparing you to do nasty things, right? So luckily, this was a Vietnam period, but they get you. I don't know if anybody's been in the military, but they want you to kill, right? That's as a infantry guy or something. So besides putting you through basic training, they also teach you to use, you have what's it called? A bayonet. All right. So they give you a bayonet training for a day. You just stab a dummy, and you go, rah. And it was a very hot day in Georgia somewhere. And everybody was like, we can't yell. And they said, if you guys don't synchronize, they didn't use that word, then we'll stay here for 6 more hours. So everybody got very excited, and we had the most beautiful kill. Okay. So again, Steve, I think you put it well. It can be used, I guess, and even with Diane's talk about morality, I think it's a context, it's the aim. You can get a bunch of growing up as a boy, not in the streets of Brooklyn, but a little bit of that. And you could do nasty things if you get the right guys together to do harmful things. And luckily, I stayed out of most of it. But they can do, you just can get together and do damaging things or hurt girls, or so it's always synchrony. Again, is for harm or for good. And morality, I would say, depends on the context of particular mission or set of norms for the particular small group, large group, nation. But I guess we're here for synchrony for the good to overshadow the synchrony for the not so good, based on some Hindu chant. I'm elaborating. Yeah.
Well, if we just take a broad evolutionary perspective, it's just, why is there synchrony in the first place? It's for good or for bad is a vantage point perspective. You certainly want the army defending your home to be in sync. You just don't want to be having that same group of men or warriors, what have you, taking that same capacity to become really in sync and doing all kinds of things that they couldn't do if they weren't. I think there's that's always the good for good and for bad, but it's for which side of the line are you on? Diane.
Yeah, Hank was very graciously saying nice things about my article, which, by the way, was published in 2009. It is a long time ago.
Right.
The reason synchrony was in that article was I was trying to talk about very different aspects of morality and moral psychology, and the emphasis there was on embodiment.
Right.
And it was an example of how coordination between people can be all the way down to the neuronal level. But another level I think we need to think about or consider within this is a developmental level. And it doesn't, neurons, yes, can be in synchrony, but also can heartbeats be in synchrony? And this is, if you've ever helped to raise an infant, you may be interested to know that parents or caretakers and babies who are engaging in reciprocal kinds of communication, their heartbeats tend to coordinate. I don't think anybody's put a EEG cap on a baby at that point, but they can monitor their heartbeats, and the heartbeats coordinate, probably the neurons do too. It seems to me that music or chanting, marching, dancing are the kinds of things that often induce synchrony. And when I say synchrony, it's not just that they're doing the same thing at the same time, but they're feeling and thinking largely the same thing at the same time, whether it's two people or an army. We're talking about rhythm, basically. I don't know, my hypothesis would be that to induce synchrony, you need some kind of rhythm. And so, yes, ritual could be something of that sort. A drum beat could be something like that. A chant, kill, 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 could also be like that. In other words, all these could induce a state of synchrony. Now, what's the effect of it is a totally different problem. It can be a kind of ecstasy.
Mhm.
If you look at audiences in rock concerts, for example, where people hold their phones up and sway together and so on to the rhythm of the band, it seems clear that that's an end state kind of thing. Now, is that good, bad, indifferent? It's human.
I think we could maybe generalize rhythm just to, there needs to be some kind of time coordination. It's an arbitrary when you start acting in sync, but we just need to start at the same time. We can't just start spontaneously. So something has to cue us in. Could be the leader, it could be some external something, but yes, rhythm definitely being a common and easy one, because you can cue people in who have no experience with whatever ritual you want them to do via rhythm. People can just spontaneously start clapping a rhythm because other people around them are doing it. They get it. But there does need to be some kind of coordination. And part of it, and what's interesting too about some of like the neuroscience aspects, which I won't speak to as like an expert or anything, but is that part of like the neural synchrony, in addition to this behavioral synchrony, is that it kind of makes it difficult to focus on irrelevant tasks. So in the brain, there's irrelevant processing, and in behavior, there's kind of other behaviors one could do. But when you're in time and it's happening in real time, it basically narrows the variability of what anyone could be doing at any given moment, which itself kind of helps reinforce synchrony, because it's kind of hard to, do something completely different when everything around you is enforcing one way to do something. So I think there's a kind of giving oneself up to that comes from that. And so I think that's interesting as well, that synchrony, we can think of it as leaning in, trying to do something the same way, but it's often just removing everything else that we could be doing and just doing this one thing. And
you can always march to a different drummer, but
hard to hear them. Rob.
First of all, I had the same experience as Hank with bayonet practice. So I really appreciated that. Everybody trying to yell kill while charging at a tire. With a fixed bayonet, plunge your bayonet into the tire, yelling kill, and nobody could stop laughing.
Oh.
So I think that the intended effect was the opposite of what actually happened. But I was interested in the temporal feature of this whole thing. It seems to me that I read long ago that women in college dorms often end up coordinating their monthly cycle. Now that's not intentional. There's no conscious activity going on, and yet it's happening naturally from other effects besides being in a group doing an activity. And I'm interested in the more subtle kinds of coordination, more subtle than fireflies or starlings or fish schooling, but things that are connected to pheromones or communication systems that are not conscious. I'm just throwing that out.
Well, I think that's like, for me, I have that similar interest in why I just keep picturing the mirror neurons and everything, because it is, we can't, I don't experience my neural activity. I don't know what's happening. But that there is ways, that basically our senses are helping cue our brains to behave similarly, puts us in similar states in ways that are below our conscious thought. So our next thought is probably a lot similar to your next thought, because we're already right there. And how do we get right there? That's like a really profound feedback loop. So then our behavior starts reinforcing it. And once you start doing that, it's easy to see, but how do we, you could imagine a version of synchrony where, like many things, there's convergence in a functional sense, but not in a mechanistic sense. I think it's really interesting that our neurons do fire together, that mechanistic alignment is there, because we could do the same things, but from totally different kind of neurological behavioral standpoints. And I think that's exactly kind of the distinction of synchrony from coordination, is that coordination is like, we're doing the same things, but not in the same way, not experiencing it at that really deep level. And then synchrony, the difference between us becomes, again, arbitrary. We're almost just like replicating that, and that happens at all, much less to the extent that it does. And thinking like, what is connecting the mind? So there's feedback loops happening here. And I think if we think of the different examples, it's kind of, you can see what's leading a given kind of loop there. And I will just make one point, that this is also similar in my mind to the difference between a group and a collection of individuals. So there's something, when we think about levels, individuals and groups in a multi-level kind of framework, you could think about it in terms of identity. You could think about it in terms of sort of costs and benefits, and, like at what level am I acting in accordance of? It's really interesting to think about that flow, that synchronous moment that happens where a group of individuals are acting so in sync that calling them a group of individuals is really, or a collection of individuals, isn't really accurate. They are a group. They are much more like one unit than they are a bunch of separate units doing something together. And so that we're interested here in multi-level kind of thinking is put synchrony as maybe like a key mechanism. I don't think it happens that often. And actually, I think it's kind of rare in a lot of ways. So it seems to be an important phenomenon when it does occur. Let's hear from Russ, and then we'll go to Hank.
Okay. The reality of synchrony and the issues that we're talking about is certainly very clear in examples from around the world, good and bad, and historically. I mean, of course, this is what Durkheim referred to as collective effervescence, and so it's been kind of part of the toolkit of sociologists for a long time, although frankly, I don't think most really know how to use it other than in mentioning in relation to Durkheim. But in my current work, I'm involved in a research project that is designed to improve social functioning and social cognition amongst persons diagnosed with schizophrenia and related disorders. that is associated with deficits in precisely the ability to read other people's emotions, to attune to others, to interact and engage socially. And it just raises a basic question, I think, about, the fact that in fact, we're not all just peas in a pod with respect to this ability and proclivity to engage with others and be able to attune our actions with others. And in fact, even whether at the level of behavior, at the level of cognitive functioning and what is called social cognition, whether at the level of, and certainly at the level of neuroscience, in other words, neural functioning, there's quite a bit of variation in all these different dimensions of what allow the creation of feelings of connection and responsiveness to others and so on, which is not to gainsay the notion that there is kind of a core human ability to do this, but like a lot of things, again, it's variable, and you can get out on the ends of the continuum where it's almost non-existent. And it's also the case, and this is exactly what the project I'm working on is about, that with concerted effort, you can in fact improve those capacities for connection and empathy and reading others' emotions, and thus both and this occurs at the neurological level too, through neuroplasticity. But you can increase functioning in that regard, and so in terms of people's development, you kind of wonder where the problems and the variation came from. Is it people had such difficult childhoods, upbringings, and so on that they kind of, gradually turned off the desire and then the ability to connect? Is some of it genetic? I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this, Hank, from the the therapeutic standpoint. But then it also raises the question, so what's the environment doing now in terms of orientation to connection with others and so on? I mean, we see all these examples of synchrony, but which lead in very different directions, as the point has been made. But how much of this is the result of socialization as opposed to neural underpinnings, and how much is it going to be changed by the tremendous impact that social media and the whole kind of disconnection of social connection from bodily experience and connection that's now occurring? And I guess that's kind of a tangent but related thought to this issue. But the basic question is, what about thinking about human variability in regard to this?
That's a really important point. It's a rare experience to have synchrony in general, and then just the more sort of common versions, we might not even really think about that variability. And what in the same hand that this is so key to human experience, such a deep part of what we do and our behavior, that, and then the individual might just kind of be cut off from that, might experience it much less through development, through environment. That means that there's a facet of the human experience that is not as accessible, and especially given that it's such a social one. And I think, yeah, the point around our new social environments, digital and otherwise, especially for those in development, it becomes really profound about what, and maybe there will be augmented new forms of synchrony. And I think we see that. I mean, if anybody's ever sort of been shook one's head at a viral piece of media or a meme or something like that, like there are interesting kinds of synchronous behaviors that are emerging, but they don't involve any of the kind of like, psycho-biosociology. We're not seeing each other's faces. We're not getting that input, feeling these things at the same time. Like what I always think about with viral posts is they already happened. That's why they're viral. By the time you see them, you missed it. And did anybody experience a synchronous moment? Or is it sort of just each one of us passing the baton alone? That's not quite the same, although it does kind of get there. And it's worrying, I think, for sure. I wanted to turn to Cesar and your point around synergy as perhaps a more a broader term.
Thanks. So this is the first time I participate here. Nice to be here. I am on the road. Sorry for connecting from the cell phone. I was very impressed by some books from Peter Corning. Therefore, I was mentioning, because he tried to explain the evolution from the point of view from synergy. And I think this is very useful because it's related to what Sage introduced, but it brings the idea of feedback loops and recursivity in different ways. For instance, when we think about the global problems that we have now, we need coordination, but it's very hard to have coordination at this level only with the core design principles, because as was said before, we have multiple identities, multiple cultures. It's very hard to coordinate, but with the idea of getting synergy, I think we can think about, for instance, constraints, about modularity, about constructors in such a way that you get in synergy. You build synergy intentionally. Therefore, I think it's a useful concept. For sure, we need synchronicity, but I think synergy is broader than synchronicity.
And synergy also removes the time component. Not, there's yeah, and it's there, of course, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah, it incorporates it. Sometimes you need synchronicity, but for synergy, you need more.
Yeah, and I think over massive scales, synchrony is like a very intimate experience. Synergy is something that can just, happen over, much longer.
Yeah. For instance, what David Sloan Wilson tells about narratives. So this is a way to get synergy.
Right.
And the narratives, they can, for instance, in the electoral periods, the narratives, they are very timely. So you get synchronicity of the people till the last moment where they vote. But the narratives are the functioning way of getting it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for your contribution, and I hope you do so again.
Thank you.
So I want to pass to Simona and then Steve, and then if there's time, Hank.
Thank you. Yes, just a comment, and I think it's also really rich discussion. I was not really understanding what do you think that is the relationship between emergence and synchrony and also intentionality. I think in humans, being that we are intentional agents, we have to actually have a volitive thought process to be in sync, except for the processes that are not conscious for sure. But I was thinking in a group, if we don't commit to, or we don't really attune to the environment, we will not be part of an orchestra. And I see this more and more. People don't commit even if they make an intentional acceptance, or like, I would like to be on this group. I'm referring to a personal experience with friends. Being in the ProSocial community, I was trying to kind of informal mentioning that it's nice for us to take different, let's see, role models in our meetings, and we could rotate, because what we experienced so far was mostly one more energetic individual organizing the events. So it's just social events. And I said, would like to not burden that person that is always so kind to organize us, to kind of rotate the roles. And it didn't happen, even though I was giving them a rhythm. I kind of said, oh, these are the conditions that we get together as friends, saying during the year, every second week we meet and somebody else will organize. And it didn't happen. And I'm wondering why. We are friends. Why this lack of coordination, and why this commitment didn't happen? So it's for me, when we discussed about emergence, I think it's so wonderful, but it's so hard to actually experience in our everyday life. So, and I think lots of ideas were resonating with that developmental stage and commitment, and this is why I wanted to comment. I think it's also, we have to reflect on how much we could influence our behavior in a conscious way, intentionally. Thank you.
Just to offer a point of clarity around emergence, I mentioned that after the example around a flock of birds, and there's a good example. Rob put a good definition for synergy, which I guess is quite related to emergence, but emergence being a new property of a system, that it's not something in any of the system behavior at any kind of atomic level. So a flock of birds, each bird is moving, and you can describe a flock's behavior using like a set of 3 rules. For example, this isn't maybe what the birds are doing, but they're following their nearest neighbors. That's all they're doing. They're following it. But then you get this flock property that emerges from all of these little individual behaviors that creates that movement. And that movement isn't something that any one bird is predicting or producing or even capable of producing. So when I think of synchrony, it's like an emergent behavior from maybe coordination. So we're in a coordinated fashion, and we can get to a level of like deep synchrony, deep coordination, where it's an emergent property of sort of coordinating something that is the zone, something that is our literal neurons firing in similar ways at the same time, the experience of which is quite different than what it was just before that happened. And then very quickly it could fade. So just to offer that emergence clarity. And what are the things that get in the way? It's actually what your point, Simona, made me think of. Well, here we are on Zoom, and how much signal we're not able to give to each other. The delay, the missing eye contact, there's all kinds of things that we in Examined Lives will only ever experience some sub-level of coordinated experience because of this medium. Although we do quite well, I think, all things aside. Steve.
Well, I had a thought occur to me as I was listening to Cesar talk about synergy, and I'm not sure if this is the definition that he meant by it, but I was thinking of synergy in terms of complementary activity. And I'm thinking of a baseball team, for example, where you have everybody, they're not in synchrony in the sense of doing the same activity, but everybody has an activity, and together they function as a team. You could think of an orchestra that way. My wife and I used to joke that the two of us combined made one functioning parent, but either one of us alone was insufficient. So I'm thinking about the relationship between synchrony and synergy, as I've just defined it in terms of complementary activity. And it's almost sort of like a yin and yang. A group, whether it's just a dyad or a larger group, perhaps a hunter-gatherer tribe, needs some balance of both. You need to have some synchrony and perhaps that collective effervescence experience and the bonding that comes from it. But also, I think day-to-day functioning requires synergy, as I've defined it, in terms of complementary activities. And just even going back to an athletic team, like a baseball team, part of their practice, even though they all have individual positions they play in a game, part of their practice is to do the same things, the same drills. So anyhow, just I think it's an interesting dialectic between those two aspects of group behavior.
I think the synchrony being not the same thing is really the most interesting version. And if you just think of musicians or a sports team, they're not all doing the same thing. That is not the point. But yet
they're all working to the same end product, and there's something that I don't know. It's just an interesting. The concepts have differences and similarities.
That's also where it feels like emergence comes back in too, because there's the emergent behavior there is like a group level intuition about each other. And yet if you follow any given baseball player, they're kind of doing a separate thing, and they're so how did they all get to this coordinated fashion? Yeah, so I think synchrony that isn't necessarily just an example of like we're all like moving in lockstep is also really fascinating, and probably more important realistically. It seems like the lockstep version is often more of these rituals, it's bonding, it's almost so on the nose that there's not a lot of practical utility outside of certain scenarios to literally get a group of people to do the exact thing at the exact same time, sitting with the bayonet. More impressive is a group of people doing a lot of different things, producing this emergent behavior that is really powerful. All right, Hank, you want the final word?
Well, just to bring up, let's see if I can do this quickly. I was thinking of the article I read. It said something about, is there such a thing as a maternal instinct? I don't know if anybody's seen it in the last year. And so I think when Rod and Russell were talking about synchrony or attunement is the language that they use in the psychotherapy field, but especially in terms of mother-baby or caretaker baby in the kind of nuclear family. And what I remember years ago experiencing in the mother-infant, well, there's a lot of research about mother-infant, and I never thought of using the word synchrony. But according to this researcher, the thought was, there is no maternal instinct. I'm going to use my words now based on our discussion. It's the capacity for the mother, the parent, the caretaker to engage in attunement or become synchronous with the infant. And so a lot of parent, mother-infant programs in this country and elsewhere, as like Russell said, are trying to do that at a very early stage. But I remember one situation was a psychotic mother, Russell, who the baby had to be taken away from her because she thought the baby's flailing, when little babies are big, she thought the baby, she was psychotic, was trying to hit her, was boxing. This is unfortunately probably not unusual, but it's common. But the lower levels, when synchrony goes awry in just parenting, and then we're all parented, many become parents, and we can sort of transmit problems in synchrony, in being synchronistic over generations, like the generational transmission of trauma over 3 generations or more at different levels. So thank you all for, especially Rod and Russell, for bringing this part up, because I never put it together with synchrony. in the way we're talking about it here. So that's just another, on the level that I work, is more individual and small groups. But the other is about the larger group thinking stage, about this level of, how did you say it? This a group level, in the emergence of a group level intuition is, I wish I had words for it a long time ago, but it's a beautiful, beautiful construct about when groups work together, not just swarm. You're like an orchestra or a good ball team. So said a lot. But
Not just swarms. That's a good subtitle of this. Human synchrony.
yeah, not just, we're not just swarms.
It's not caught in the you see those ant death traps, or they just keep going and going and going because they can't.
Right.
Stop. Well, this is a great conversation and great discussion. Really appreciate the different perspectives here. It's a kind of a fuzzy topic in a lot of ways, even though it seems like so specific. We're going to meet again in 4 weeks, July 27th, where Steve will lead us in a conversation about adaptive fictions, which amazingly we haven't discussed before. I really almost felt like we had, but that'll be good. Anything to say there, Steve?
No, of course, there are maladaptive fictions as well, but there are some that are adaptive. Would be an interesting topic. This was discussed in the evolutionary philosophy group, and there's a short video and a paper related to it. I thought it would be a great topic for this group as well.
Great. Okay. See you all then, and be well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Looking forward. Bye.
Thank you.